Today's discussion is on the issue of care for creation. Friar Tim, why is care for creation one of the 7 pillars of Catholic social teaching?
Very clearly, this is also a fairly new development, to be really honest. The whole question of really a theological look at creation from a moral perspective is very much a 20th century issue. It's an interesting point. If you look on the Catholic Catechism, which was written in 1983, and you look at the question of creation, it's all dealt with dogmatically. That is, it's the whole question of God who creates, and it's looked at from that end, not at all from the moral end. But increasingly, the Church has begun to look at Genesis 1 and 2, the whole question of creation at the very beginning of the Bible, and the whole question of Genesis 1:2 reiterates this whole question of what is the relationship of humanity to creation. Now, it's a very interesting thing in and of itself. You and I are sitting in the conference room. If someone were to suggest to us, you should get into creation, we would have a tendency to walk out of the room and go outside and look for a tree. But the reality is that we are in creation in this room because we created this room, we created this building, somebody created this table, and we're here with Mary Catherine and the camera, all of which were created by somebody as well. So it's a question increasingly of getting humanity to realize that creation is not merely nature, so to speak, but we are an integral part of that. Now, the biblical notion, when you look at things, and here I'm stealing an idea from Bishop Robert Barron, the biblical notion of creation notes that humanity is created last. And Bishop Barron frequently talks about this from a liturgical perspective. That is, the one who presides at liturgy is always the one who comes in last in the procession. And that makes us kind of the high priests of all of creation. Now, when we're the high priests of all of creation, what actually does that look like? And very commonly, we looked at creation in the past in a much more threatening kind of a manner. And now we look at creation much more in a friendly kind of manner, which asks us at the same time to not overly exploit that. So again, there's the basis of where all of this comes in from a moral perspective.
Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, he writes, quote, "The word creation has a broader meaning than nature," unquote. In what sense does the term creation have a broader or different meaning than the term nature?
Again, this comes back to a theocentric Christian notion of a transcendence. To speak of Mother Earth as a creation means that this creation has a creator, and that creator is still intimately involved in creation. And entrusting this creation to the high priest, to get back to my earlier answer, to entrust this creation to the high priest is a divine entrusting of responsibility to humanity, which then, frankly, asks us at a given point to render to God an accounting of our stewardship. Understanding creation as this gift of God, let's also be rather frank that perhaps only in the 19th and 20th centuries, but beginning a little bit earlier in the whole scientific revolution that occurs from the 17th century on, up until that time, creation was considered to be something, frankly, rather threatening. Because creation, of course, has things like earthquakes and storms and floods and unexpected droughts and onslaughts of locusts and insects. And when you went into nature, you didn't necessarily find an idyllic thing. You might find wild boars or wild wolves or wild bears, lions and tigers and bears, oh my, that would devour you. So nature was not considered, creation was not considered to be completely idyllic. And therefore, when Christianity interpreted these first two chapters of Genesis, it tended to interpret the word that expresses the relationship of humanity to creation in a little bit more of an aggressive term. So in very many biblical translations, we'll still hear, and to Adam and Eve are given dominion over creation. That word dominion comes very close to dominate. And that's an inaccurate translation from the Hebrew, and rabbinic scholars will very clearly point that out, that it's a better translation in English to talk about questions like stewardship, okay? So this whole question of where we are, we have to continually come back to the whole question of creation and not merely nature, because creation sets us much more in this relationship with God, to which stewardship of that creation has been entrusted to us.
Well, Friar Tim, St. Francis of Assisi is often called in Catholic teaching as an example of living with care for creation. Can you give some examples of how St. Francis lived his life with a great care for creation?
Well, there are several. There are any number of stories in the early biographies of St. Francis of Assisi that talk about an extraordinary connection with nature, and a lot of nature miracles, such as healing the wolf of Gubbio, etc., etc. Frankly speaking, as a historian, those are very common to other saints, so I don't think that's particular to St. Francis. But there are two things that are very particular, I think, to the saint. The first is that in the very first example of poetry written in vulgar Italian, towards the end of his life, Francis composed what is known as the Canticle of the Creatures. And this is a version of it we sing fairly regularly here at Newman. Come dance in the forest, come play in the fields, and sing to the glory of the Lord. So it's become a part of where everything is. And from this comes what Franciscans sometimes deride as reducing Francis to the saint of the bird bath. Because very commonly, there is Francis in the garden with a bird in his hand and a bird bath below him. Very, very, very commonly done. But it does exemplify what Francis does, is in speaking of creation and the elements of creation as being related to him, as brother and sister and mother, and not as being an object to dominate or not being an object to fear, but to speak of a relationship, Francis slowly begins to turn the corner to a much more positive view of creation. And I would add to that the whole concept of Franciscan, what we would call the trade minoritas, friars minor, the M of the last initials of my name, the minoritas. Francis would be incredibly allergic to any kind of notion of dominion or domination. We don't dominate anything or anyone. We are in relationship and we serve. So Francis is kind of officially recognized as the patron saint of ecological awareness.
Well, our economic expert for this session on care for creation is our Newman parishioner, Mike Salemi. Mike has been a member of Newman for 26 years, and he's Professor Emeritus of Economics at UNC. So, Mike, what does economics have to say about the stewardship of creation?
Now, at its core, economics is the theory of how people choose and how market prices guide their choices. In most cases, economists believe that markets do a better job of allocating resources than governments, and they oppose government programs that interfere with markets. But there are important exceptions, where a central authority must be involved in the marketplace if resources are to be allocated efficiently. This is the entry point for what economists have to say about the stewardship of creation.
Mike, you mentioned important economic exceptions that require more involvement of a central authority in care for creation. What kind of exceptions do you have in mind?
The most important exception is the production or consumption of goods and services that involve what we call third-party effects. For many goods, the price of the good incorporates all of the costs of the good. For example, the price of a loaf of bread includes the cost of grain, oil, yeast, and labor that are needed to produce the bread. When a consumer buys a loaf of bread, they personally bear all of the costs of its production and consumption. But for some other goods, the price of the good does not include all the costs of the good. For example, the cost of manufacturing a cigarette is 6 cents, but smoking a cigarette creates secondhand smoke, which is a cost borne by individuals who happen to be near the smoker but had no role in choosing the smoking activity. Those who breathe secondhand smoke are the third parties in cigarette production and consumption. The third-party costs are the impacts to their health. The manufacturing price of a cigarette does not include the cost of secondhand smoke. Governments tax cigarettes to face smokers with third-party costs. And given that those costs are substantial, the price is higher and it's a disincentive to smoke. Global warming has a lot in common with the problem of third-party effects in cigarettes. Those who burn carbon-based fuels pay a price that does not include the costs associated with the effects of increased carbon emissions on the warming of the planet. Those costs are many and large and include rising temperatures and sea levels.
What would economists suggest to address the problems associated with fossil fuel use?
Economists believe there are important roles for both governments and markets in addressing the impact of fossil fuels on global warming. The market by itself will not face consumers with third-party effects. Governments must either tax such goods or limit their production. Consumers, if the market is to work, must face all the costs, both manufacturing and environmental, if use of fossil fuels is to be curtailed in an efficient way. For example, if a consumer paid both the manufacturing cost and the third-party cost of a gallon of gasoline, which of course, as we said before, includes rising temperatures, rising sea level, deteriorating quality of the atmosphere, then they would realize that the relative cost of, say, an electric chainsaw, an electric lawnmower, or an electric automobile, they're smaller than they were before because they will not use the high-priced gasoline. Bottom line here is that faced with the higher price of gasoline, consumers would tend to choose alternatives to tools and transportation that use fossil fuels. Well, what are the third-party costs of a gallon of gasoline? What is the price that the gallon of gasoline should be? Now, that's a very complicated question because the answer depends upon decision makers throughout the economy, not just the producers, not just the people who buy gasoline, but all the people who create alternatives and others who create incentives to those alternatives. So it's a very complicated question. And at this point, we do not have a mechanism to identify that cost. Economists would prefer an economic scheme where markets would determine the third-party costs of gasoline. Suppose, for example, that the government determined the maximum amount of carbon-based fuels, the consumption of which would be compatible with meeting the scientific targets for global warming. So we'll let our scientists decide the trajectory of fossil fuel use, which is compatible with holding back climate temperatures and preserving a healthy environment, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. Tackling the third-party effects goes a long way toward solving the problem of global warming and other crises for the planet. Solving the problem would entail stewardship of the planet.
Hey, Father Tim, Pope Francis is calling for immediate action to reduce the adverse effects of our failure to take proper care of our creation. What actions might the Catholic Church take to respond to Pope Francis's pleas?
Yeah, once again, we come back to my standard answers of this, which is the formation of conscience, the raising of consciousness around these issues, and beginning to think of them more in an ethical question. Here, the real issue around creation today is how our advanced technology affects Mother Earth. Because, frankly speaking, in ancient and medieval and through to the early modern period, Mother Earth could replenish herself very, very easily. There's no doubt. Yes, there are repeated climate changes where the Earth gets warmer and the Earth gets colder. That's all very clear. The cooling of the Earth probably occurred around the year 1300, which contributed to the bubonic plague. All that is also very clear. But the invention of human technology today raises the issue that perhaps we are going too far in our technology so that the Earth cannot replenish itself. These are the dire warnings that climatologists keep reminding us of, certain thresholds at which we rise. Here, we need to begin to more and more clearly take a biblical vision of humanity and human dignity and apply it to the whole question of technology, which raises the very simple question: just because humanity can do something, is it advisable and ethical that humanity should do something? This, by the way, is the basis of the moral vision of the Oscar Best Winning Picture of this year, Oppenheimer, which raises that whole question about atomic power and atomic power regarding the use of energy. So, if it can be done, should it be done? And how does one assess biblically and morally and spiritually the what, the why, and the how? How then do we assess some of the technological decisions that we need to make? Does this technology, what effect does it have on human life? Is it positive? Can we perhaps foresee some negative or even worse, unintended consequences? But in our own modern society, in which increasingly human activity is divorced from any kind of transcendent plan of God for us, the technocrats among us consider any technological development as being just simply a dare that should be done because we can do it. And frankly speaking, it falls into the whole question of human hubris. This notion that we are the unmitigated masters of the universe. A Christian vision always says that man's capacity to co-create, man's technological prowess, the human ability to create and transform and develop the world is a good entrusted to us by God, but it also has limits. And it also always must be subject to God's original plan for us. That's the first and foremost thing. The second, we need to regularly raise our consciousness around the idea that very commonly the negative effects on our environment and on creation are disproportionately borne on the backs of the poor. We have an acronym for this in American society that we call NIMBY, not in my backyard. Since we want the technological advancements, but we don't want the dirtiness and the messiness that comes with it, if we are comfortable and privileged, we tend to dump all of that on the backs of the poor. The backs of the poor in the United States, let's face it, chemical plants are never in good neighborhoods. And increasingly in our globalized economy, we dump that on the backs of the poor of the third world. So that's a second consideration. If we talk about a preferential option for the poor, how can we allow all of our technological development to be borne disproportionately by the backs of the poor? That's your second ethical issue that the church needs to raise some consciousness about. The third one is, if we truly are our brother's keeper, in the whole question of solidarity that we talked about earlier in these video casts, then not only am I my brother's keeper, but very frankly, I am also my children's keeper, and my grandchildren's keeper, and my great-grandchildren's keeper. So if I do not think about what my decisions regarding technology and consumption of non-renewable resources in the world, if I consider that as long as it's mine, great, I'll keep consuming and I'll be happy and I won't take any kind of a cut in my standard of living, what effect does that have on my children, my grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren? So once again, the church tries to raise these three ethical issues regarding creation. Again, to summarize, the first one, if we can technologically do it, should we do it? Secondly, in a world in which we talk about the preferential option for the poor, if the poor disproportionately bear the brunt of this. And third, if in solidarity I am my brother's keeper, what about my children and my grandchildren? Notice how these 7 principles of Catholic social teaching all interweave and intertwine together. Why? Because these are not 7 separate things, but this is the basis of the way in which Catholic Church asks us to reflect upon our social life.
Well, Friar Tim, on behalf of our parishioners, thank you for your comments on each of these 7 principles of Catholic social teaching. And also thank Mike Salemi for his comments on the economics of the issue of care for creation.
And thank you, Carl, for such thoughtful questions. And thanks to our experts for bringing in their professional expertise on this. Thanks for Mary Catherine for putting this together. And thanks for all of you for your attention. I hope this has been spiritually fruitful for you during this Lent. God bless.